Welcome to the tutorial Layer Parameters. So since the last tutorial, I added two toolbars to the top here, and that's the scripting toolbar and the advanced animation toolbar, and I did that by going to Windows, Toolbars, and then selecting them from this list. And with the maintain size tool, I just brought the birds back, so these are the birds right here, so that they're just in front of the mountains. So today I want to talk to you about layer parameters. So let's scroll down in the timeline to the mountains and let's uncollapse the layer. So you can uncollapse it either by clicking on this plus sign so you can see all of its transformation values, or if we close this again, you can use the keyboard shortcut Alt F, and that also uncollapses the layer. And what we're going to talk about with this layer, you could also do with a peg. So it's the exact same thing that you would do using a peg in the timeline, or working with a peg in the timeline. So if we take a look at our values here, we see that the position is divided into the X, Y, and Z values. So they are separate in this case. They are not locked together. And that is the same thing with the scale. They're separate and not locked together. And right now, I know for a fact, because the rotation only has one value here, the angle Z, the 3D rotation is not enabled. So having the positions locked or separate is really a matter of preference as well as the scale. For scale, it's sort of an obvious choice. If you need to scale things uniformly, generally you want them always locked together. If you want to have a lot of squash and stretch going on in your animation, you want them separate because you won't be able to elongate or squash anything if the values are locked together. That's the same thing with the positioning. If you want a lot of smooth transitions, it's better to have them locked together. However, if you know you're going to need to animate things very specifically, like I did with the sliding door, I want to make sure that the Y value is not going anywhere, or I just want to animate on one of the three axes. It's better, and you have a lot more flexibility if you have them separate. So right now, if I wanted to create a new layer and I wanted these locked together, instead of having them separate, and I wanted that to be my default, so every time I create a new layer, these values are locked together, I would have to go to my preferences to change it. So on Mac, that's under Animate Pro, Preferences. On Windows, that's under Edit, Preferences. So if we go to the General tab, and under the Settings section here, you'll see that it says Default Separate Position for Elements, Default Separate Scale for Elements, and they have the same thing for pegs here at the top. So an element is a general way of calling a layer or a module. So if you see drawing element or peg element, that could be a peg layer or a peg module, or just a peg element if you're just giving it a general name. So we're going to uncheck these just so you see what happens here. So instead of making them separate, they're going to be locked together. So I'm going to hit the Enter button to validate my change. And you're not going to see anything here because these are still separate and these are still separate. However, if I create a new layer and then uncollapse it, you'll notice that there's only one path position. And unlike the mountain here, where you could see position X, Y, and Z, here you only have a single path position because they're locked together, and you only have one velocity. This velocity is applied on all three of these path positions, where here you can apply a separate velocity to the three different path positions as you're animating. And that's the same thing for the scale here. It's locked together so you can only scale uniformly, whereas here you can scale the X and Y values as we said before. So what we changed in the preferences, just to reiterate, was to change the default preferences every time you create a new drawing element, i.e. another drawing layer or module. So I'm just going to delete that. So if we want to change the individual preferences for this specific layer, so it's not going to happen every time I create a new layer, but just for the mountains, you can double click on it to get the layer properties, as you see here at the top. And you also have the ability here to choose whether you want to have the scale being separate or the position being separate, or if you want them locked together like that. And so you can see a noticeable change here. So now this looks like the new layer that we created. There's only one path choice, there's a velocity choice now, and the scale is locked together. So it's generally recommended to keep these things separate, which I'm going to do. And the other thing I wanted to show you is that if you enable 3D here, you all of a sudden get all these choices for the rotation, and this is for 3D rotation, and I'm not going to go into that too much here. We will go into that later. But you also all of a sudden have some options here, and this is of course only for Animate Pro users, not for Animate users. You don't have this option to enable 3D, so you won't see any of these preferences in your layer properties panel. And you have the choice between quaternion and I believe you pronounce it Euler angles. It looks like it's Euler, but I think the correct pronunciation is Euler. So quaternion, what it does is it's essentially locking the three values together, the x, y, and z. And there's generally a fourth number, and what that is it takes these three position points and it actually places them in the correct order. And maybe you don't need to know all that detail, but what you do need to know is if you choose quaternion, the velocity is applied on all three equally, so you can't give a separate velocity for the x, the y, and the z. And also that this option is generally recommended if you're doing long, smooth trajectories in 3D space. However, if you choose the Euler angles, it's basically giving a separate value that you can enter in for the x, y, and z, and you can apply the velocity separately once again. And you also notice here that there's a change in the timeline. Here you have three separate rotations, and here you only have the quaternion, and then the velocity that you choose here will be applied to all three position points. So I'm going to disable that. So that's pretty much it for the tutorial layer properties. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, adding and deleting keyframes.